Hello, everyone. My name's Melissa, and I wanted to welcome you all to this week's Student Guide Art Break. I'm really excited to be here today with you all, and I'm going to be sharing two different pieces from the Cantor Art Center, and I wanted to talk about them from my perspective as a social science student. And I encourage you all to keep track of your own reactions and thoughts and questions throughout this talk, and you can send them in the chat if you want to, and I can address them during the Q&A discussion in the last 10 minutes. And so let's go ahead and get started. I first wanted to tell you all a little bit about myself. So I'm in my fourth and final year here at Stanford. I'm doing my undergraduate studies in psychology, and I specifically study developmental psych. So I'm really interested in early childhood education and how children learn about themselves and how they learn to persist and be motivated. And I'm also pursuing my master's in sociology, where I'm really interested in studying race and gender and how those intersect in education. So more of a macro level or structural view of education. And so why do I focus on education in both of these disciplines? Well, ever since I was a kid, my parents just instilled in me this really deep value and love for education. And as immigrants from the Philippines, they really fervently believed that American schools would be the key to a better future for their children. So me and my little sister. And I grew up thinking that education is what would make me free. And I bought into these narratives of meritocracy and upward mobility that are often perpetuated in this country's education system. But as I grew older, I realized that education was not as liberating as I once thought it was. I began to see just how unequal and unjust our schools have been and continue to be. And now as a psychology and sociology student, I spend a lot of my time learning about the roots of this inequality and how this injustice is perpetuated in our education systems. Beyond the theories and the empirical arguments in the fields that I study, I find that art is often what helps me best grapple with the emotional complexity of societal issues. And so today I wanted us to take a look at two artworks from the civil rights era that both reflect issues at the intersection of race and education. And my goal is not to just learn about these pieces in their historical context, but also to have us think about these pieces' connection to our present moment. And so without further ado, I'd like us to start with the first piece. And so I'd like us all to take about 30 seconds or a minute to just take this piece in. If you can and you want to, you can jot down what you're noticing about this piece. And you can notice as well what emotions this piece is evoking for you. And you can send your notes in the chat if you'd like, and I'd be able to read them as people are taking a moment to take this in. Great, so if you're still looking, go ahead and keep thinking about this piece, but I also wanted to look at some of the comments that are coming up in chat. And so I'm seeing things like hurt, anger, intensity, suppression. Someone said that the smiles even feel like mockery, and I'm assuming we're looking at the smiles on these figures here. Someone sees a young girl who's carrying books, surrounded by evil figures, and that there's wounds in this picture and everything else is colored. And so great, I just wanted to share with you all what I saw when I first looked at this piece. And so I looked first at the figure in the middle, who is a Black girl wearing a white dress and Mary Janes, and she's clutching her books like some of you noticed, so it might mean that she's a schoolgirl. She's pierced by these arrows and she's bleeding, which a lot of you also noticed. And I also took note of these monstrous beings all around her. And like you, I was really struck by the colors, the blue and the red faces that blend into the background. And I also thought that maybe some of them are taunting her. And I also noticed the flowers at the bottom of the piece, which feel out of place in a piece that's really marked by anxiety and hurt, like many of you said. And this piece is called The Ordeal of Alice, and it was painted by Jacob Lawrence, who some of you might know as a major artist from the Harlem Renaissance. And he's known for his colorful and modernist depictions of everyday life for Black Americans, especially in Harlem, as well as historical narratives. And so before we dive further into this piece and talk about what it might mean, I want us to also look at another artistic depiction of a similar scene. And it's a painting called The Problem We Live With by Norman Rockwell, and some of you might have seen it before. And so Norman Rockwell's piece and this piece were both painted in the 1960s, less than a decade after Brown versus Board ordered schools to be desegregated. And before I advance to the next slide, I just wanted to acknowledge that the next piece does depict a racial slur, the N-word, and I want to acknowledge that that piece was painted by a white artist. And I want us to think about these things and about this piece in its historical context and in conversation with the piece that we're looking at now. And so I'm going to go ahead and advance to it now and have people take a look at this piece now, Norman Rockwell's The Problem We Live With. Perhaps the most striking difference to me between the previous piece and this work is how the central figure is depicted. In the work, this girl is almost surreally calm in her courage amongst this chaos and hatred. And the girl in the painting, many of you might already know her name, and I think I already saw the name in the chat. Her name is Ruby Bridges, and she was on her way to the newly integrated William Franz Elementary School in Louisiana, and she is seen here escorted by federal marshals. And it was a really widely controversial painting at that time because Rockwell was known for his quintessential American paintings that captured lifestyle and culture of the time. And people, perhaps mainly his white audiences, didn't expect him to paint a picture like this and address racial issues in America. But over time, Ruby Bridges, as painted by Rockwell and it's photographed in many national news outlets, she became a symbol of bravery at what seemed like the dawn of a new era of integration. And this portrait has actually been hung in the White House right outside the Oval Office, and it was installed during the Obama administration at Ruby Bridges' request. And so I want us to go back to the first piece now, and I want us to consider how Jacob Lawrence, who himself is a Black artist, depicts a very similar scene, but from a vastly different perspective. And so in sharp contrast to Rockwell's piece, Jacob Lawrence focuses on and captures in this really vivid color and striking imagery, the pain and inner turmoil of the central figure. It's worth noting that he titled the piece Ordeal of Alice, so it's not necessarily about Ruby Bridges, and I'm not sure if he was trying to represent a specific girl at all. But nonetheless, he captures the suffering of a Black girl who's attending what we assume to be a previously all-white school, and he does so in a really wrenching way. These arrows that are piercing her symbolize the violence and discrimination that are faced by Black children as white Americans resisted desegregation and integration in the 60s and 70s. And so whereas Rockwell's piece might have served to shame or educate a white audience, Lawrence seems to be drawing our attention directly to this girl in his painting, and he wants us to think about her pain and her suffering and how it was directly caused by the people around her. I think what's really missing from Norman Rockwell's painting is the fact that Ruby Bridges' family suffered gravely because she went to school. Her father lost his job. They weren't allowed to shop at the local grocery stores anymore. And her grandparents, who were in a whole other state, Mississippi, they lost their land as sharecroppers. And white families boycotted school and showed up to protest as Ruby Bridges walked to school every single day. And they shouted threats to poison her, so they even threatened her life. And some have speculated that Lawrence's portrait might be based on a photograph of Elizabeth Eckford, who was in Arkansas and attended Little Rock Central High with 8 other Black students, and they were known as the Little Rock Nine. And they were tormented by white classmates throughout their time attending there. And Elizabeth Eckford suffered from PTSD after spending just 1 year at that high school. And one last thing that I want us to notice about Lawrence's piece, and somebody actually just mentioned it in the chat, is that the imagery of the arrows might be alluding to the story of the Saint Sebastian. And he's a Catholic saint who was shot through with arrows, and yet he survived. And so we can think that maybe there's an underlying message here too about the resilience of Black Americans in the face of such hatred. And so ultimately, I think Lawrence's painting reminds us that we can't sanitize historical narratives, and we shouldn't make a spectacle of Black sacrifice or suffering. And rather than just looking at disadvantage and pain, we also have to take a look at the other side of the coin, at the demons of privilege and power and white supremacy that cause this suffering for people. And so where are we 60 years after these paintings were created? Black students in the United States today are just as segregated as they were in the 1960s before desegregation orders were seriously enforced, according to the UCLA Civil Rights Project. And even in schools that seem to be more integrated, there's little contact between white students and students of color, in large part due to tracking, which is the placement of students into different academic groups based on performance. And those of us who are perhaps familiar with local Bay Area high schools might have heard that it's like there's 2 different schools within one school, the way that white students and students of color are siloed into different tracks. And studies have shown that counselors are less likely to recommend Black and Latinx students for honors or AP classes, regardless of their actual performance in school. And so, although Jacob Lawrence's painting may seem like it depicts a bygone era, in reality, 60 years is not a lot of time, especially considering the persistent resistance of whiteness against the integration of students of color into schools. And so now here we are in 2021, and we're still grappling with questions of integration, equity, and anti-racism in our education systems. And so I'd like us to kind of switch gears now. And I want everyone to kind of take a moment to close their eyes and imagine for a second what an art historian looks like to you. So just picture somebody who comes to mind first. What does that person look like? And I want us all to keep that picture in mind as we look at our second piece for today. So I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next one and keep that image in your head. And so just like before, I want us to take about 30 or 40 seconds to look at this piece. And again, you can jot down the notes that you, or the reactions that you have to this piece. And I'd love to see your reactions in chat again. All right, so I'm starting to see some chats, and feel free to keep jotting down notes for yourself, or you can send a message if you want. But I'm seeing somebody notices the pail with the rag in the corner here. It's asking, is this a teacher or a custodian? And then somebody said that when they thought of an art historian, the first image that came to mind was a white female figure. Somebody thought of an art historian wearing thick-rimmed glasses. Somebody said, maybe this person is learning because he's come in to clean. Great, so thank you for sharing your thoughts in chat. And I, just like last time, I kind of wanted to share what my first impression was when I looked at this piece. And so I'm really drawn to figures. So I first looked at the man on the left, and I noticed he was directly staring at me in this casual pose on this desk that he's sitting at. And then I was really interested to look at the chalkboard, like all of this writing on here. And I thought, okay, maybe he's in an art classroom because we're seeing some mainstreams of modern art, the English School of Painting, something about American painting down here. And so I was like, okay, maybe this person is learning in this classroom or teaching in this classroom about art. And then, like many of you, I also noticed, this was after I noticed the figure, I noticed the pail with a rag in it. And then I looked back at the figure and I realized he was wearing some coveralls and some boots. I thought maybe this isn't traditional like teacher or professor attire at the time. So maybe we'll reevaluate and think, okay, maybe he's a custodian who's in the classroom. And like many of you guessed, that's exactly right. And this is called Portrait of a Custodian as an Art Historian. And it's a photograph from the same year that Jacob Lawrence actually painted his piece. It's from 1963. And so the photographer of this image, Jerry Ullsman, is perhaps better known for his work making composite photographs that juxtapose images in these really surreal or implausible ways. And knowing this about his work, I was wondering, what does it mean for him to juxtapose a custodian and an art classroom? And why is it such a juxtaposition to have a Black custodian sitting in front of a chalkboard? And I just wanted to note again that this photographer is white, so we can think about this issue of perspective, again, by returning to the ideas we briefly touched upon earlier with Norman Rockwell about the positionality of the artist and how that impacts what artists depict in their piece. And so returning again to this photograph, I think that it brings to mind issues of race and class in the civil rights era. And so again, noting that this is from 1963, the same year as Jacob Lawrence's Ordeal of Alice. And I think that race and class, specifically Blackness and poverty, have become intertwined because of structural issues in the United States, ranging from housing discrimination and redlining to under-resourced schools and hiring discrimination. And looking at the historical development of higher education as well, since we're talking about this art classroom, perhaps in college, it's clear that colleges in the United States were also initially developed exclusively for white able-bodied men who owned property. So for instance, Harvard didn't admit any women or Black students for nearly 2 centuries after its founding. And nowadays, in contrast, colleges are ostensibly open to anyone, and universities are more than eager to advertise just how inclusive they are in their mission statements, and in their pamphlets, they try to feature a diverse array of students and recruit students that look more like all of America. But we know that despite colleges' outward expressions of how much they value diversity, issues of race and class still affect higher education today, and they still affect the perception of Black and low-income students in higher education. And so in psychology, one landmark study that we often point to when we're thinking about race and education is Claude Steele's work on stereotype threat. And so in situations where people are aware that they belong to a stereotype minority group, they experience something called stereotype threat, which is this awareness that they belong to that group, and that negatively affects their performance because they're scared or aware of this risk of confirming stereotypes about their group. And so in their classic experiment, Claude Steele, who was in our psychology department here at Stanford, he gave Black and white Stanford students a half-hour test that used really tough items from the verbal GRE, or the graduate version of the SAT. And in the stereotype threat condition, he told students that the test diagnosed intellectual ability. And so the reason for that was he was trying to potentially elicit a stereotype for the Black students in this condition, and kind of elicit that stereotype that they're less intelligent than white students. And then he also had, for comparison, another condition with no stereotype threat. And the students were just told that the test was a fun problem-solving lab test. It had nothing to do with ability. They were just trying to see how people did on this random task. And that was supposed to render the stereotypes and the stereotype threat irrelevant. And it's really interesting to see how in the stereotype threat condition, Black students performed much worse than white students. But when you took away that stereotype threat, they performed much better. And interestingly enough, white students' performance decreased. And so this study is from the 1990s, but I think that the stereotype of Black people being less intelligent or less successful still manifests itself in our schools and in our media and our day-to-day life. And the pervasiveness of this stereotype has damaging effects on people of color's self-esteem and achievement and well-being. And the same cultural beliefs that made Olsman's original photograph of a custodian as an art historian so interesting or striking, those same cultural beliefs are alive today. I've taken classes with Black professors who told us that they can name multiple occasions where someone was surprised to find out that they were a professor. And I've heard my classmates who are Black recount times that they've had to show their Stanford ID to prove they weren't in trouble. And I've had Black friends disclose their hurt from having to bear microaggressions from non-white classmates. And fellow low-income classmates, they have to juggle jobs and classes and are often financially supporting families back home, all the while not being taken seriously in the classes that they take with upper-income classmates. And so here at Stanford, I'm glad to see that to some extent, students of color and first-generation low-income students do have community centers and resources. And during February, the university has made some effort to commemorate and honor Black History Month. But in terms of substantive change, perhaps the university could go beyond an email or mere recognition. And so, for instance, in recent months, students have called for Stanford to departmentalize the AAAS program, the African American Studies program. And I'm glad to say that just this week, it was finally confirmed that they would be departmentalizing that. So a huge congratulations to all the activists and students and staff and faculty who supported this petition. But there's also still more to be done. For example, with the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute, there's been a lot of calls for more funding for them. And there's also been calls to support first-generation low-income or FLY students, especially during the pandemic. And so by no means do I want to say that no progress has been made since the civil rights era. And quite the opposite. I think that the two works that we looked at today, this photograph as well as Jacob Lawrence's The Ordeal of Alice, remind us of the immense work that have been done by civil rights activists to fight oppression in the United States. However, I do want us to think about how we still live with the same problems of prejudice and discrimination and white supremacy, which manifest themselves in subtle but dangerous ways today. And so from sociology, we've learned that inequalities are baked into the structures and institutions that sustain everyday life. So it's baked into our schools, our political systems, our financial and economic systems, as well as our residential systems and neighborhoods. And from psychology, we know that negative stereotypes about Black people are just as strong and salient as ever, and that those stereotypes have detrimental consequences for Black people and their communities. And so my philosophy as a student guide has always been this, that we're here not to just look at art, but also to learn something from it. And so I really look forward to hearing your questions from me in just a second and having a discussion in our last 10 minutes here. But I also have some questions for you as an audience that I'd love for you to think about. And you can take a moment to reflect on these, and you could write for yourself, or you could send your responses in chat like you've been doing so wonderfully this whole time. And so one question is whether you're a student or a parent or an educator or just a community member who's here with us today, what aspects of the education system must change to be more equitable? And how do you see yourself personally contributing to making that change? And of course, we're here, or I'm here as a student guide at the Cantor, so I'd love for us to also think about the role that museums and museum education specifically can play in promoting racial justice. And so I just want to thank you all again for your active participation and listening. And I'd love for us to transition into thinking about these questions or asking any questions that you might have about the pieces we looked at today. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and look at the chat now to see if anything is coming up. Oh, thank you so much. I see people sending really awesome thank yous and comments in the chat. So thank you for that. Thank you. And Rosemary saying the role that museums can play is more programs like this. Thank you. I know that the Cantor does have a lot of programs like this that engage with really important social issues. So I hope you're able to see those as well. And some people are asking about other events that are happening. And I just want to briefly go to this slide here and just advertise that there's more art breaks that are coming up with other student guides. So my friend Anu is going to be doing one in just 2 weeks. And my other friend Alyssa will be doing one 2 weeks after that. So I invite you all to, what do you call this? Register on the Eventbrite. It's the same link that you went to for this one. And then Marilyn's saying in chat, museums need to diversify who is educating people about the art. So thank you for that comment, Marilyn. I totally agree that when we see ourselves represented in the museum space as well, we're able to engage in a lot of different kinds of conversations. So thanks for that comment. Yes, and Cynthia, the Cantor does have an entire collection of Jacob's paintings. So it'd be incredible for us to look not just at this Ordeal of Alice, but other pieces that Jacob Lawrence has in the Cantor collection. Grace, I totally agree. I hope that young students do get exposed to arts and are invited to engage in conversations like this. And then Maya, I don't know if I'm saying your name right, but Maya says museums need to create more public art installations as many people can't afford the entry fees. One thing I really am proud of about the Cantor is that we are free admission and that during the pandemic, we've had a lot of online programming that's hopefully accessible to people. Awesome. And I'm sorry if people can hear some motor stuff going on in the background that's happening below me. So hopefully you can still hear me okay. Awesome. Some people are saying they've never seen these pieces from the Cantor before. I'm glad we got to take a look at them together then. And Cynthia's saying these kinds of things are important, but desegregation must be greatly improved at the neighborhood and pre and elementary level. Totally agree. It's so striking to see in the map that I showed or in like other statistics, just how segregated our country still is, and that continues to get worse and worse. So thank you for that comment, Cynthia. Oh, and Maya is from Canada, so welcome. It's really great to see how other people from around the country and around the world, oh, Maya, okay, are joining us for this. Awesome. Any other last comments or questions before we say goodbye today? A lot of people are asking about whether this is archived or recorded, and I don't know. I think Mackenzie might have responded individually to people, but I don't know the answer to that 100% right now. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and, oh, thank you all so much. Thank you for your thank yous. Alrighty, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen real fast. And just so I can see the chat a little bit better. And yeah, I think if there's no other questions or comments, again, I wanted to invite you all to continue participating in Cantor programs. And really, thank you so much for all your engagement. I loved reading your comments and seeing your questions. And it was great to be able to, even though I couldn't see you all face to face, it's great to see your thoughts in chat and to engage with what you all have been thinking and feeling throughout today. So thank you all so much. I hope that you have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I hope to see you around the Cantor for future events too. Take care, everyone.